Hideo Kojima is more than a bit obsessed with cinema, everybody knows that. Humorously, he describes himself online as being made 70% of movies, and it seems that nothing transforms him from the legendary director to a grinning fanboy faster than a chance at a selfie with a Hollywood star. Now, from a gamer's perspective, his obsession with Hollywood is actually a very good thing because it ushered in a new age of cinematic gameplay. And while he might have dreamed of one day tapping into Hollywood's top talent, for many years the only resource available to him was whatever he could duplicate from the movies he watched, having passionately absorbed over 100 years of global filmmaking. Cinematography, say, which meant painstakingly directing the camera at all times to create atmosphere during gameplay or to turn simple dialogue into captivating cinematic scenes.
Hey!
This simply wasn't done before Metal Gear Solid, but his obsession with directing the game like a movie meant that what might have started as an indulgence would actually pave the way for what became the industry standard. Cinematographers have been getting Oscars for almost 100 years, so it's hardly a secret art, but it is an art, and as with all art, you either painstakingly do it yourself if you have the know-how, or you pay good money to get the movie industry to come in and do it for you. And eventually everything from cinematic scores from the likes of Hans Zimmer's Apprentice through to experts who established complex military realism would all become commonplace in his productions, because his all-encompassing obsession with the world of cinema meant that the scope of his knowledge was boundless, and therefore, much to Konami's frustration, from the very beginning his vision was only ever limited by budget. You just know when you're playing a Hideo Kojima game because his attention to detail is unmistakable, which basically is the definition of auteur. In his earliest days, even when the budget was next to nothing, he never compromised on cinematic fidelity. He proved enough of a film connoisseur that amazingly he managed to achieve his vision almost entirely in-house, either himself or by overseeing an elite team of incredible artists. But he branded himself as the face of the production, just like a film director, from the very beginning, and Konami no doubt encouraged this because they went on to wield his name as a powerful marketing tool. Of course, the pomp of Hollywood styling suited him down to the ground, but the continued years of this style of self-promotion ensured that Kojima became and remained the sole face of the production, earning pop culture kudos for virtually every aspect of the game. He may well have been the glue that held the ship together and the rudder that gave it direction, but the ship did consist of many talented people, most of whom you've probably never heard of. But there was of course one area of the production that would prove impossible for Kojima to recreate himself, as he neither spoke English nor had access to American actors, and so this element was entirely outsourced by Konami.
What are you trying to say?
I want to ask you, do you think love can bloom even on a battlefield?
Yeah, I do. I think at any time, any place, people can fall in love with each other. But if you love someone, you have to be able to protect them.
I think so too.
I have a favor to ask.
Uh-oh.
Don't worry, it'll be easy.
I told you before I don't want to hurt anyone.
I don't want you to either.
Okay.
And yet, despite being completely outside of his control, to Kojima's good fortune, the small team of relatively unknown talent at the time did him so proud. And one person in particular would go on to achieve an almost equal cult status at the time. Not by choice it would seem either, but rather just due to the merit of his performance and how he conducted himself with fans thereafter. I am, of course, talking about David Hayter. And while there are documented cases of animosity between Kojima and ex-members of his team, some of whom have taken shots at him over the years and mostly been rebutted by fans for being bitter over the dismissal, this simply does not fly with Hayter. He famously plays and loves the games, attends the festivals, and has tirelessly serviced the fan base over the years.
Kept you waiting, huh?
But most importantly, he requested half his paycheck be slashed on the remake of MGS, The Twin Snakes, in order that the original cast be invited back to re-record their audio.
I just got such great respect for, especially David. He's just, number one, very talented but number two, just a good man.
It would have been nothing without the original cast. How could they even have considered that? Dedication to his colleagues, or the franchise, who knows? But no one has ever questioned his loyalty to the series, nor his significance in its success. My point here is, this is one member of the Metal Gear team who you can trust when he speaks, and like any professional, he's always remained respectful when asked on his thoughts about Kojima and indeed how and why he was replaced by Sutherland as Venom Snake. For context, misinformed fans will often argue that Venom was a different character and so warranted a different voice. It simply isn't true for a number of reasons, but the most obvious being that the Japanese actor Akio Otsuka played all the Snakes throughout the series and was never replaced. Add to this the fact that Sutherland actually voices Big Boss himself.
I'm in front of the prison camp. We gave her a light. She took the short way down.
As opposed to using Hayter for a couple of lines. And lastly, if you can make this guy look like this guy and create nanoviruses that
activate upon a specific language, vibrating the vocal cords to a specific amount,
then you're in a freaking world we can make a person sound different too. There are arguments and counter-arguments and counter-arguments, and it all just gets so exhausting because the most devoted Kojima fans will go to any length to defend his honor. But suffice it to say, even the highly respected and long-time casting director for the entire series, Chris Zimmerman, disapproved of Kojima's choice to push David out, as explained on the brilliant interview between the original MGS voice team and Game Informer. She played a pivotal role in harnessing the original voice actors to the Western audiences, and so I take her word over anybody else's.
But it must have been a little bit heartbreaking for you, having worked with David Hayter for all those years, to get the news that you're not going to be using him this time around?
It was very difficult, yes. It was very difficult. It was sad.
Fans have always speculated over whether Kojima didn't like Hayter because he stole the limelight, or whether he'd just been so desperate to rub shoulders with Hollywood royalty that offering his coveted role of Snake seemed to be the best way to do this. Or indeed, both. Well, now that Kojima is no longer associated with Konami, and shelve your dislike for Konami for just a minute because this has nothing to do with them, but since then, Hayter and indeed the rest of the team have interestingly started to be a little bit more candid in their recounting of working with him.
Well, it's horrible because I felt like I'd given a lot to the series and I'd really helped promote it and been a cheerleader for the whole thing. You know, people are like, are you going to play the game? And I'm like, yeah, that'd be 60 hours of humiliation that I can't wait to get to. So I didn't play latest 2 iterations because it's just too painful. You know, I don't have any ill will towards Kiefer Sutherland or anything like that. The whole thing could have been handled better and a little more respectfully, but I'm not going to cry about it. They made me re-audition for Metal Gear 3 to play Naked Snake. They made me re-audition to play Old Snake, you know, and the whole time they were trying to find somebody else to do it. I heard that Kojima, he asked one of the producers on Metal Gear 3 to ask Kurt Russell if he would take over for that game, but he didn't want to do it.
I wasn't interested in expanding financially off of something that we had created or that I had created in terms of a character. And then I look at it and I go, that's not written by John. That doesn't smell right.
Mr. Sutherland was very professional. He did a really good job. And I do know that Kojima had always wanted to have a Hollywood star part of the process.
Right. I'm sure it's fun for him. I mean, he's such a Hollywood fan, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Is it just his love of Hollywood where he's always wanted to work with this A-list talent, or what's promoting that?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know Kojima at all, really. But I never felt like he was a particularly big fan of mine. I don't think he liked the fact that I got a lot of attention for the role when he was meant to be the rock star of the whole thing. But that's just conjecture.
Do you think there's any chance you'd ever want to work with him again? I feel like you two are so connected to the outside world. Do you feel any connection to him on the inside world between you two?
No, I was kind of hoping that Konami would bring me back now that he was gone. No, I think he handled it pretty badly, and I've got no particular love for Kojima. I respect him, and I think he's a brilliant game maker. I don't know him as a person, and as a businessman, I was not impressed. So no, I don't feel any need to go back and work with him again.
Any bitterness aside, I think the main takeaway here is that there is a clear disconnect between the development, which is entirely a Japanese production, and the Western audiences, and the production teams that facilitate that.
So all we were doing was matching with English language what the Japanese had done already.
For characters like Mei Ling and then Naomi who come back in 4, the choice to change the accent was coming from Japan?
Yes.
And no insight as to why that would be?
No.
I just wanted to let you know that. No, that's not the whole truth. Not many people could recognize 4D sound data in a soliton radar file.
Does that kind of inconsistency bother you, or you?
No, it did bother me because they were characters that existed before, and I don't really know why they decided to do that. That very end scene where Otacon romantically mounts the snowmobile. We kept telling them, Americans, it would be like pals, so can we macho it up a little bit? And they're like, no, it has to be like the Japanese version.
Want me to drive?
No thanks. I'd rather do it myself.
No problem.
So that's why Otacon and Snake are riding off into the sunset if Meryl dies.
There was seemingly a brick wall between the Metal Gear leadership in Japan and the Western voice team in America, and as Kojima is demonstrably obsessed with overseeing every detail, it's understandable that some have surmised in the past that perhaps Konami tied his hands, and he was simply unaware. But this theory has seemed increasingly less likely over the years as more members of the original team share their stories. The most infamous relates to somebody who Kojima arguably owed a tremendous debt of gratitude to for making what pretty much everybody recognizes as necessary improvements. And yet Kojima ensured that this man would never work at Konami again for taking the initiative. I'm talking about the tragic treatment of Jeremy Blaustein, which has gained an almost cult notoriety in the industry. An ex-English teacher in Japan who found himself shuffling papers in Konami's international business department. He would take on English translation tasks ad hoc, completing Vandal Heart and Castlevania Symphony of the Night on his own before returning home to the snowy hills of western Massachusetts with his wife, 2 small children, a wood stove, and not much money. Konami contracted him to translate a secretive and exciting new project, and with just 6 months and no advance payment and next to no guidance as something this colossal had never been undertaken before, he set to work on Kojima's immensely detailed and exciting new script. With no internet at the time, he lived and breathed military jargon through ex-Navy SEAL Richard Machinko's books, visits to the library, and countless war and spy movies. He threw his heart and soul into it, endeavoring to capture the spirit of Kojima's vision while designing unique dialogue infused with believable military jargon, suitable for Western audiences used to Michael Bay and Tom Clancy. The experience proved to be so intense and stressful that he turned to cigarettes and, ironically, diazepam, which is what spawned the line,
You know a lot about science, but you don't know how good a cigarette tastes in the morning.
And this was far from his only addition, with a huge number of expositions being localized to avoid the jarring dialogue that is inevitable when Japanese is translated directly, as well as things like Snake's earpiece, which was just called a wireless in Japanese, which he inventively changed to codec.
She designed your codec.
Having stumbled across the phrase in his research. Or when Campbell tells Snake to acquire locally, Blaustein coins the term OSP, or on-site procurement, which had me fooled for years as a kid, and clearly others too, as it's still used to this day. Kojima loved the way that it sounded so much that for the Metal Gear Solid Integral expansion, he wanted an option for players to play the Japanese audio with English subtitles and vice versa, but upon trying to align the subtitles with the audio, it became apparent just how many liberties Blaustein had taken. Kojima was not impressed, and it cost Blaustein his job, who has since cited Kojima's lack of appreciation for the needs of localization due to his not being bilingual as the reason. Kojima locked down the translations from that point forward, with Blaustein pointing to recent lines of dialogue in The Phantom Pain as an example of what happens when Kojima refuses to give his English-speaking editors the autonomy to transpose his dialogue into terms that would realistically be spoken by Western characters.
I won't scatter your sorrow to the heartless sea. Plant your roots in me.
Of course, there are players that find this sort of thing endearing, and probably a whole lot more that just don't care.
Oh, that. No preference.
Oh yeah? Most of the girls here go for one or the other.
But for those who played the series from the beginning, it was impossible not to notice the poetic delivery of surrealist dialogue that continued to creep in. Plenty of scenes were still awesome and totally engaging. The voice acting never ceased to be outstanding, and there were plenty of charming exchanges which did enrich the overall experience.
Be gentle, of course.
When taking a holistic view of the series, it is clear that the budget and hardware constraints were what limited Metal Gear Solid to being a compact linear adventure that progressed from scene to scene like watching a good military thriller.
It would take at least 5 people to go over that limit.
Look out, Snake! The guys who stole my stealth prototypes are in there with you! Too late, Snake! Now die!
It's no secret that, like Metal Gear 2, the title that came before it, he shamelessly patched together his favourite movies and characters from those movies to create a rich tapestry of tributes, which arguably allowed him to put his main focus on technical innovations like cinematic presentation and stealth gameplay. The handcrafted nature of the story meant that it funneled you through memorable set pieces with a carefully paced, evolving narrative that began with engaging macho banter.
That takes care of the cremation.
And ended in philosophical arguments about what it meant to be a soldier with a license to kill if your government is morally corrupt.
Why do you continue to follow your orders while your superiors betray you?
And all of it served as the perfect platform for Blaustein to infuse it with real-world technical jargon that meant no matter how surreal the story started to get, the experience always felt like it was grounded in realism. When it comes to Ground Zeroes, it was actually only supposed to be the opening chapter of the Phantom Pain, but Konami's growing concerns over budget meant that it was released as a demo-cum prequel. But the isolationist nature of the infiltration, and the focus on cinematic introduction of characters, and the high ratio of cutscenes to gameplay, along with the gut-wrenching story twists within them, did actually make it about as close to a spiritual successor to MGS as you could get. Having then adopted an open world approach and having absorbed the excellent base management system from Peace Walker, the addictive combat and complex living world of Phantom Pain was the stuff of Game Awards for sure, but the memorable set pieces and absorbing cinematic progression of the past was now heavily diluted by swaths of generic scenery and offbeat story occurrences that were no longer utilized to carry the game, but rather to punctuate the stellar gameplay, which had become the main focus of the experience. Scenes like Quiet's torture that would pop up almost at random when returning to Mother Base after a seemingly unrelated mission in which you may or may not have had her at your side simply made no sense and required you to accept the more modular approach of the story elements, which of course was a stark contrast to the fixed narrative progression of the first. Regardless of the why, when Kojima did assemble his stories out of elements from proven action rompers at the time, and even if it wasn't intentional, allowed third parties to edit, localize, and infuse his writing with a sharp layer of believability, the result was described at the time as being the finest PlayStation game ever made. And that is a timeless accolade because it didn't rely on aging gameplay to get that score.
What?
It was the complete package. MGS will always be a 90s thriller, and for those wanting to experience a taste of the time, it is a timeless example. However flawless the Phantom Pain was at the time of release, it'll be subject to a far higher degree of aging due to the reliance on refined gameplay and technical prowess at the time, and will have less to show for the era in which it was released as time moves on. Ground Zeroes will probably be better suited for retro gaming if future gamers want a taste of the time, and Kiefer Sutherland's performance will ultimately prove to be pretty forgettable, as his presence in the overall series did next to nothing in order to lift it to new heights.
Kept you waiting, huh?
Both Blaustein and Hayter played essential parts in carrying out Kojima's vision and lifting him to the top, whereas Sutherland, who is an excellent actor no doubt, almost equates to a cameo in comparison, whereas you won't find so much as a photograph of Kojima with the first two. He can be seen pressing up against Sutherland anytime you look. Remember that his role as overseer meant that he was indirectly the boss for all of them, and if you've ever had a boss who treated you unfairly after you worked hard to earn their faith, just remember how much it stings. No matter how much you loved his work, his lack of candor in the way that he treated members of his team, when you compare that to how he very publicly acts with equivalent members of his team who just so happen to be Hollywood stars, it is just disappointing revelation when the content of his game suggests a man who places serious value in morality and karma. Snake smokes because he's a 90s badass, but when he does it, his freaking health goes down.
Cigarettes are poison, they kill people.
Classic Kojima. Love it. The positive changes he's brought to the industry and to people's lives, mine included, are undeniable. Metal Gear Solid 1 is in my top 5 favourite gaming experiences of my life, and I will probably go to the grave praising his countless endeavours. But always, always within context. A like, or better yet a subscribe, would mean the world to me, so a little click from you is a massive win from me. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the video. Hopefully see you next time.